Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading chapter 21, so let's get into it. Chapter 21. They carried Benedict's body up the gangplank all together, Quentin and Josh and Elliot, struggling awkwardly with his heavy ragdoll limbs. Death seemed to have made his lanky, adolescent body strangely dense. Slipping on the wet wood, they had none of the gravitas that would have been appropriate for pallbearers. Nobody had worked up the courage to take the arrow out of his throat, and it pointed crazily in all directions. Once Benedict was laid out on the deck, Quentin went and got a blanket from his cabin and spread it over his body. His side was throbbing hotly in sync with his pulse. Good. That's what he wanted. He wanted to feel pain. It was Bingle who drew the arrow expertly out of Benedict's throat. He had to snap it in half to get it out, because one end was barbed and the other feathered. It began to rain steadily, the drops tapping and splashing on the deck and on Benedict's pale, unflinching face. They moved the body inside, into the surgery. Although there was no surgery to be done. "We're going," Elliot said aloud to nobody and everybody. "Quentin," Elliot said, "it's the middle of the night. I don't want to stay here. We've got a good wind. We should go." Elliot was officially in charge, but Quentin didn't care. This was his ship first, and he didn't want to spend another night on this island. It's all fun and games till somebody gets an arrow through the throat. "What about the prisoners?" somebody said. "Who cares? Leave them here." "But where are we going to go?" Elliot said reasonably. "I don't know. I just don't want to stay here. Do you?" Elliot had to admit he didn't especially want to stay either. There was no way Quentin was going to bed. Benedict wasn't going to get warm tonight, so how could he? He was going to get the ship ready. Looking down at Benedict's blank, unfeeling face, Quentin was almost angry at him for dying. Things had been going so well, but that was being a hero, wasn't it? For every hero, don't legions of foot soldiers have to die in the background? It was a matter of numbers, like the corpse in the castle said. Just work out the sums. So Quentin, the Magician King, leader of men, helped corral the rest of the defeated soldiers and got the crew watering and provisioning the Muntjac, even if it was the middle of the night and pissing rain. Somebody else would have to plot the course, since Benedict was dead, but that wasn't a problem, because they didn't know where they were going. It didn't matter. He didn't understand what they were doing anymore. It was obviously a very effective way to procure magic keys, but how was that going to help Julia, or rebuild the Netherlands, or calm the clock trees? What could the keys possibly be good for that was worth this? Benedict curled up on the dock like a little boy trying to get warm. They all worked together through the night. They way-faced and industrious. Julia sat with the corpse, slowly reassuming her human form. Her mourning dress, for once entirely appropriate for the occasion. Also fully in character was Bingle, whose haunted demeanor had darkened to funeral. He spent the night by himself, haunting the ship's bow, hunched in on himself in his cloak like a hurt bird. Once Quentin went forward to see if he was all right, but he heard Bingle mumble to himself, "Not again. I must go where I can do no further harm." And Quentin thought, maybe I'll leave him to work that out by himself. The sky was paling through the rain clouds when Quentin went out alone into the square in front of the castle to finish the job. He was chilled through the bone tired. Chilled through and bone tired. He felt like the living corpse in the library. He wasn't the best person for the job, but it was his job to do. He got down on one knee in front of the little obelisk, with a hammer and a chisel, which he'd borrowed from the ship's carpenter. Probably this could be done by magic, except he couldn't remember how just now. And he didn't want to do it by magic anyway. He wanted to feel it. He set the point of the chisel against the stone and started chipping. When he was done, there were 2 words there, ragged, but legible. Benedict Island. Back on the ship, he gave the order, eastward ho, though everybody knew what the order was before he gave it. Then he went below. Quentin heard the anchor being weighed. The world tilted and came unmoored, and he was finally gone. The Muntjac ran fast ahead of a freezing gale. It drove them across vast, islandless stretches of ocean, pushing the sails which meekly accepted the abuse and ran even faster. Enormous emerald green swells urged them onward from below, rising up under them and then rolling on ahead of them, as if even the sea had had enough of them and couldn't wait for this to be over. Elliot had made the voyage out sound like nonstop riches and wonders, islands of mystery 24/7, 365, but now the ocean was a complete blank, scrubbed mercifully free of anything remotely fantastical. A clean miss. Maybe the islands were moving out of their way. They had become untouchable. They didn't see land once. It was as if they were taking a grand leap outward into nothingness. The only miracle that happened on board. It was a small miracle, but it was a real one. 2 nights after Benedict died, Poppy came to Quentin's cabin to say she was sorry about what had happened and to see how he was. She didn't leave till the next morning. It was a strange time to have something nice happen. It was the wrong time, it wasn't appropriate, but maybe it was the only time it could have happened. Their emotions were raw and close to the surface. Quentin was surprised, to say the least, and one of the things that surprised him was how much he wanted her. Poppy was pretty, and Poppy was smart. At least as smart as Quentin, probably more so. And she was kind and funny when she let her guard down a little, and her long legs were as absolutely wondrous as anything Quentin had ever seen in this or any world. But beyond that, Poppy had something Quentin wanted almost as badly as the wordless physical forgetting of sex, which would have been enough. God knows it really would. And that was a sense of perspective. She wasn't completely caught up in the grand myths of quests and adventures and whatever else. Deep down, she didn't especially give a shit about Fillory. She was a tourist here. Fillory wasn't her home, and it wasn't the repository of all her childhood hopes and dreams. It was just a place, and she was just passing through it. It was a relief to not take Fillory too seriously for a while. When he'd imagined something like this might happen, he'd always imagined it with Julia. But Julia didn't need him, not this way. And when it came right down to it, the person he needed wasn't Julia either. Quentin hadn't been celibate since Alice died, but he hadn't exactly been cutting a swath either. The problem with sleeping with people who weren't Alice was that somehow it made Alice even more gone. It meant really, truly knowing and admitting that she was never coming back. With Poppy, he let himself know it a little more, and that should have made it hurt more, but strangely, it made it hurt a little less. "Why don't you stay?" he said one day, while they were eating lunch in his cabin, cross-legged on his bed, fish again. Come live in a castle for a while. I realize you're not a Fillory nerd like me, but haven't you ever wanted to live in a castle? Haven't you ever wanted to be a queen? If or when they eventually made it back to Castle Whitespire with or without that last key, it was going to be something less than a triumphant homecoming. It would be good to have Poppy beside him when he sailed back into that harbor for moral support, and for immoral support too. Poppy salted her fish within an inch of its life, then drenched it in lemon juice. No amount of flavor seemed to be too much for her. You make it sound romantic. It is romantic. That's not just me. Living in a castle is objectively romantic. See, this is spoken like somebody who didn't grow up in a monarchy. Australia still has a queen. There's a lot of history there. Remind me to tell you about the constitutional crisis of 1975 sometime. Very unromantic. I can promise you there will be no constitutional crisis if we go to Whitespire. We don't even have a constitution. Or, if we do, I promise you nobody's ever read it. I know, Quentin. She pressed her lips together. But I don't think so. I don't know how much longer I can stay here. Why not? What do you have to go back to? My entire life? Everybody I know? The real world? This world is real. He scooched over next to her so that their hips touched. Here, feel. That is not what I meant. She put her plate on the floor and lay back on the bunk. She hit her head on the wall. It wasn't made for a tall person, let alone two. I know. Quentin didn't know why he was fighting her on this. He knew she wasn't going to stay. Maybe that's what made this so easy, that he knew the outcome in advance. There was no chance that she would get too close. He was playing to lose. But seriously, what's back there for you? Your dissertation on dragonology or whatever? Or tell me you don't have a boyfriend. He took her foot in his lap to rub. She had new calluses from walking around the ship barefoot, and he picked at one. She snatched the foot back. No, but yes, my dissertation on dracology. I'm sorry if that seems very boring to you, but it's my thing, and I happen to like it. There are dragons in Fillory, I think. Well, maybe there aren't. I've never seen one. You don't know? You could find out. You could apply for a royal research grant. I can promise you your application would be looked upon favorably. I would have to start all over again. I'm not ripping up 4 chapters of my dissertation. Anyway, what's wrong with a little unreality? Quentin said. Unreality is underrated. Do you know how many people would kill to be where you are? What, in bed with you? He pushed up her shirt and kissed her stomach, which was flat and covered in very fine, downy hair. I meant here in Fillory, he said. I know, she sighed, prettily and genuine. I just wish I were one of them. It was all very well to decide that Poppy was going back to the real world. Or not very well, but it was what it was. But it was an open question how they were going to get her there. They could be confident that at some point Ember would turn up to kick her out of Fillory, as he always did with any visitors. But that could take weeks or months, you never knew. And she didn't want to wait. Quentin might have been in paradise, but Poppy was in exile. In the end, they decided to try the keys. They didn't have the one from After, which had gotten Quentin and Julia to Earth so efficiently, but they all looked more or less the same apart from the size. They started with the last and biggest, the one they'd found on Benedict Island. It was stowed in Quentin's cabin, still in the wooden box it came in. They brought it up on deck. Poppy had come with nothing, and she had nothing to pack. Quentin supposed Josh would want to go back too, in the fullness of time. But he didn't seem to be in any hurry. He was already talking about which room he'd get back at Whitespire, and Quentin preferred to give Poppy a private send-off. The key had lain in its box so long its three-toothed jaw had worn a shadow of itself into the red velvet. He offered it to her, like a fancy cigar. She picked it up. Careful. It's heavy. Poppy turned it over in her fingers, weighing it. Wow, it's not just gold, it's magic. The spell work on this thing is thick, dense. They looked at it, then at each other. I sort of felt around with it in the air, Quentin said. You should find an invisible keyhole. It's hard to explain, it's more a learn-by-doing thing. She nodded, she got it. Well? Wait. He took both of her hands. I didn't ask you properly before. Stay here. Please stay. I want you to. She shook her head and kissed him softly on the lips. I can't. Call me next time you're in reality. He knew she would say that, but it made him feel better knowing he'd really asked. Poppy made a few experimental self-conscious pokes in the air with the key. Quentin wondered idly if the key understood that they were on a moving ship. Suppose it opened a door in the air and then got stuck. It got stuck and they immediately left it behind. The key tugged out of Poppy's hands. The door lost behind them in midair and mid-ocean. He halfway hoped it would happen. But no such luck. Old magic usually had any obvious bugs or loopholes like that worked out long ago. Quentin didn't hear the click, but he saw when her hand met resistance in the air. The key slid in. Keeping one hand on it, she gave him another kiss, this time with some extra sugar in it. Then she turned the key. With her other hand, she found the doorknob. A crack opened, and there was a poof of air pressure equalizing. The sun didn't shine through like it had before. It was dark. It was odd to see an oblong of night standing upright like that, at the deck of a ship in broad daylight. Quentin walked around behind her and tried to peer through it. He felt a cold draft, winter air. She looked back at him. So far, so good. She wondered what month it was on Earth, or what year even. Maybe the time streams had gone haywire and she'd be walking into a far future Earth, an apocalypse Earth. A cold, dead world orbiting an extinguished sun. His arms goosebumped, and a couple of errant snowflakes spun out and melted on the warm wood of the Muntjack's deck. I had a dream, which was not all a dream. Good old Byron. Something for every occasion. Poppy let go of the key, ducked her head, the portal was slightly too low for her beanpole frame, and stepped through. He saw her look around and shiver in her summer dress, and he caught a glimpse of what she was looking at. A stone square. The door began to close. The key must have let her out at her last known permanent residence, namely, Venice. It made sense. She could crash at Josh's for a bit. She would know people. She would be safe there. Or no, she wouldn't. That wasn't Venice, and she was all alone. Quentin lunged forward through the closing door after her. Poppy! She'd stopped just over the threshold, and he barreled into her from behind. She squeaked, and he grabbed her around the shoulders to keep them both from falling over. Then he reached back to keep the door from closing, but it was already gone. The air was freezing. The sky was full of strange stars. It was night, and they were not on Earth. They were in the Netherlands. For a second, Quentin was almost glad to see them. He hadn't been to the Netherlands for 2 years, not since he and the others had traveled to Fillory. They made him feel nostalgic. The first time he'd seen the Netherlands, he'd felt, maybe for the last time in his life, pure joy. The kind of uncut pharmacy grade, white-hot joy that comes with believing. or not just believing, but knowing, that everything was going to be all right, not just then or for the next 2 weeks, but forever. He'd been wrong, of course. In actuality, that knowledge had lasted about 5 seconds. Just up until Alice had punched him in the face for cheating on her with Janet. It turned out that everything was not going to be all right. Everything was chance, and nothing was perfect, and magic didn't make you happy, and Quentin had learned to live with it. Which it turned out that most people he knew were already doing anyway, and it was time he caught up with them. But you didn't forget that kind of happiness. Something that bright leaves a permanent afterimage on your brain. But the Netherlands, he knew, had always been warm and peaceful and twilight. This Netherlands was pitch dark and bitter cold, and it was snowing here. More snow had drifted in the corners of the square, huge, creamy swaths of it. And the skyline was different. Of the buildings around the square, the ones on one side looked exactly the way they always had, but the ones on the other side were half gone. Their black silhouettes stood out, jagged against the deep blue sky, and the snow in front of them was mixed with big blocks of fallen stone. You could see all the way through to the next square over, and through that into the next. "Quentin," Poppy said. She looked back for the door too, trying to account for both his presence and her surroundings. "I don't understand. Where are we?" She hugged herself against the cold. They really weren't dressed for this. She wasn't panicking, though. "This isn't Earth," Quentin said. "This is the Netherlands, or these are the Netherlands. I've never really made up my mind which it is. This is the world in between Earth and Fillory and all the other worlds." "Right." He told her about the Netherlands. "Okay, well, it's nice and all, but it's cold as hell. Let's get out of here." "I'm not actually sure how we're going to do that. You're supposed to come in through the fountains, but you need a button to do that." "Okay." Their voices vanished in the frozen air as soon as they spoke. "Well, but do a spell or something? Why did it take us here?" "I don't know. They've got a sense of humor, those keys." It was hard to think in the bitter cold. He studied the empty air they'd just appeared out of, his breath smoking. There was really nothing left of the portal back to Fillory. Poppy walked stiff-legged over to the fountain. They were in the Fillory Square. The fountain had a statue of Atlas in it, coiled and braced under the crushing weight of a marble globe. The water in the fountain was frozen. The level of the ice was actually above the stone rim. She felt it with her hand. "What the shit?" she said quietly. She didn't sound like herself. It was dawning on Quentin how much trouble they were in. It was cold here, really cold. It couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 degrees. There was no wood, nothing to make a fire with, nothing but stone. Quentin remembered Penny's warning not to do magic here. They might have to test that. "Let's go over to the earth fountain," he said. "It's a couple of squares from here." "Why? What good would it do if we don't have a button?" "I don't know. Maybe there's somebody there. I don't know what else to do. And we have to start moving or we're going to freeze to death." Poppy nodded and sniffled. Her nose was running. She looked more frightened now than she had back on the island, when they were fighting for the keys. They started to walk, but immediately broke into a jog instead to warm up. Apart from their footsteps, the silence was absolute. The only light was starlight, but their eyes were adjusting rapidly. All Quentin could think was that this wasn't going to work, and after it didn't work, things would get very bad. He tried to do mental calculations about thermodynamics. There were too many variables, but hypothermia wasn't far in their future. A few hours at most, maybe not even that. They trotted through the broken cityscape. Nothing moved. They crossed a bridge over a frozen canal. The air smelled like snow, a stupid mistake, and now they were both dead, he thought giddily. The Earth square was bigger than the Fillory one, but it was in no better shape. One of the buildings showed a row of empty windows through which the stars were visible. The facade had survived the catastrophe, but the building behind it was gone. The fountain was frozen, too. The ice had plugged the great bronze lotus flower and cracked it all down one side. They stopped in front of it, and Poppy slipped on black ice under the snow and just managed to catch herself. She popped back up, slapping the wet off her hands. "Same," she said. "All right. We need to find a way out of here, or we need shelter and something to burn." She was rattled, but she was hanging on to her nerve. Good old Poppy. She set a good example, and it woke him up a little. "The doors on some of these buildings look like wood," he said, "and there are books inside the buildings, I think. Maybe we could get some and burn them." Together they walked the square till they found a broken door, a Gothic-arched monster that had been knocked askew. Quentin touched it. He broke off a splinter. It felt like ordinary wood. They would have to try a fire spell. He explained about how magic acted in the Netherlands. It was supercharged, explosive. Penny had said never to use it at all, just desperate times. "How far away can you cast a fire spell from?" he said. "'Cause we'd better be as far away as we can get when it goes up." "It goes up," came out of his numb lips, sounding like "I'd go dump." He said it again, enunciating a little more clearly, but only a little. This was going downhill faster than he'd thought. They didn't have long at all, maybe 15 minutes more in which they could plausibly get a spell off. "Let's find out," she said. She began pacing backward away from the door, back toward the center of the square. He couldn't help thinking that this was just a stopgap, a way station on the road to the inevitable. After they'd figured out how to light a fire, they'd have to find shelter. After they found shelter, they'd need food, and there wasn't any food. His mind churned uncontrollably. They could melt snow to drink, but they couldn't eat it. Maybe they could find some leather book bindings to chew on. Maybe there was fish under the ice in the canals. And even if they could survive indefinitely, which they couldn't, how long till whatever broke the Netherlands came along and broke them? "All right," Poppy called. "Quentin, move!" He pressed his palm against the wood, if that's what it was. If this didn't work, could they make a magic button from scratch? Not in 15 minutes. Not in 15 years. There was a crack between the two doors. Thin blue light shone faintly through it. Starlight. But it wasn't starlight. It flickered. "Hang on," he said. "Quentin?" He caught a note of desperation in her voice. She had her hands jammed in her armpits. "We don't have much time. I thought I saw something. There's something in here." He pressed his face up against the frozen wood, but he couldn't see anything more. He went from window to window, but they were all dark. Maybe from the other side. He yelled at Poppy to come on and ran through an archway to the next square over. The building was a huge Italianate palace with evenly spaced windows. He considered for a moment the possibility that they might be even worse off if whatever was in there making blue light came out here, but it seemed unlikely that it could offer them a more lingering, unpleasant death than the one they were about to experience anyway. He wondered if, before he died, he'd sink so low that he would pray to Ember to save him. He thought he probably would. There was no door at all on this side of the palace, but the facade was broken. It ended in jagged stone above the second rank of windows. He could probably get over it if he had to, which he did. A frozen wind was coming up. He wondered what had happened here. It had been so still and protected before, a world under glass. Someone had cut the power and smashed the windows and let the elements come roaring in. A running jump got him up on the first window ledge. He thanked God or Ember or whoever for the architect of the Netherlands' excessive fondness for Baroque ornamentation. He could tell the rough stone was taking skin off his cold fingers, but he couldn't feel it. "Stand there," he said, and pointed. He put a foot on Poppy's shoulder, which he accepted with good grace. From there, he could get a foot on the upper molding, and a hand on the window ledge above it, which wasn't enough for a good grip, but was all he was going to get. From there, he jumped and grabbed the top of the broken wall. He had to will his fingers to bend. With his cheek pressed against the cold stone, Quentin risked to look down. Poppy was watching him expectantly. Her lovely face was pale and grave in the starlight. Slowly he hauled himself up until he got a forearm over the wall, then clumsily hiked his knee up onto it. He looked down for the first time into the interior of the Netherlands. It looked like he remembered pictures from the London Blitz looking. There was no roof, and most of what had been the second floor had fallen in and lay in ruins on top of the first. The floor was awash with paper, stirred in slow circles by the wind. Books, large and small, lay sprawled in various states of intactness, some whole, some spread-eagled and eviscerated. At the far end were remnants of the upper floor formed a partial shelter. Someone had arranged some of the more intact books into tall, neat stacks. The man who presumably had arranged them stood among them. Or no, he wasn't standing. He was floating, a foot off the ground, with his arms spread out. That's where the blue light was coming from. There were runes on the floor below him that gave off a faint, cold glow. Either he was a fellow refugee from the destruction or the author of it. It seemed like a good moment to take a bad risk. "There's someone inside," he called down to Poppy. He raised his voice. "Hey!" The man didn't look up. "Hey!" Quentin yelled again. "Hi!" Maybe he was Florian. "Quentin!" Poppy said. "Hang on. Hi! Hi! Quentin, the doors are opening." He looked down. So they were. The doors were opening outward, all by themselves. "Okay, I'm coming down." It wasn't much easier coming down. He'd lost all feeling in his fingers. He took Poppy's numb hand in his own. This really was their last chance. "Shall we?" he said. It sounded even thinner than he meant it to. That's it for today. We will see you guys next week with Chapter 22.